Hey, my name is Dean Calloway. I'm 32 years old, and I do residential masonry out of a rented house on the south side of Zanesville, Ohio, a city on the Muskingum River, known mostly for its pottery history and for the Y Bridge downtown, which is the only bridge in the country you can cross and still end up on the same side of the river. I've always liked that about it. It suits a place where things aren't always what they appear from the start. I've been doing masonry for about 8 years. I came to it the way a lot of people come to trade work, which is by doing other things first and finding out they didn't fit. I tried a year of community college, a year of warehouse shipping, 6 months working for my uncle's landscaping company, and then I ended up holding a brick for the first time, helping a neighbor repair his front steps, and something about the weight of it, the directness of the material. The fact that what you built at the end of the day was exactly and only what you'd laid with your hands. That was the thing that stayed. I apprenticed informally for about 2 years under a mason named Frank Ederle, who'd been doing the work since the 1980s, and who taught me that there is no shortcut in masonry, and that trying to find one will embarrass you publicly. What I build is mostly walls. Retaining walls, garden walls, chimney repairs, front steps, patio floors, the occasional full stone foundation repair on an older house. I work alone, which suits me. I work outside, which also suits me. The work has a rhythm you learn after a few years, laying a course, checking the level, setting the mortar, cleaning the joints, and that rhythm is its own kind of quiet. The thing most people don't understand about masonry is that the mortar is the work. The stones get the attention. People choose them, admire them, describe the wall by them. But a stone without mortar is just a weight. It has no connection to anything around it. Stack stones without mortar, and the first hard freeze will scatter them. The mortar is what makes stones into a wall. It's the thing between things. It's invisible when it's right, and ruinous when it's wrong, and it's the part that takes the most patience, because you cannot rush it. Mortar cures on its own schedule. You can do everything correctly, and then put pressure on it too soon, and the whole thing fails. The work teaches you, after enough years, to let things take the time they need. My days look like this. I'm up at 5:30. I have a drip coffee maker that I've had since I was 22 and have repaired twice, which I consider a point of pride. I'm loaded and on the road by 6:15, which means I get to a job site while the morning is still cool enough to think clearly. I work until the light goes bad or the mortar runs out or whatever I'm working on reaches a point where stopping makes sense, which is usually somewhere between 3:30 and 5. I come home, clean up, eat whatever I put together in about 15 minutes, and sit on the porch if the weather allows. My neighbor Walt, who is 67 and retired from a paper mill in McConnellsville and has an opinion about the weather that is more detailed than any forecast I've ever heard, comes over sometimes and we sit without talking much. That's one of my better friendships. The phone doesn't light up much after 8. I wake up and do it again. I had a relationship that ended about 2 years before this story. Her name was Rachel. We'd been together 5 years, close enough to engaged that I'd thought about the ring more than once. She was patient with the work for a long time, patient with the early mornings and the physical exhaustion, and the way I sometimes came home too tired to be someone worth talking to. She waited for me to become a person who had something left at the end of the day, and eventually she stopped waiting, and I don't hold that against her. She was honest with me the whole time about what she needed, and I wasn't able to give it, and she found someone who could. I was glad for her after a while. It took a while. What I kept from that, more than the loneliness of coming home to a quiet house, was a particular belief I'd formed somewhere in those 2 years, that I was the kind of person who was better useful than present. that what I had to offer was my hands and my reliability and my willingness to stay until a thing was done, and that was more than most, and I should be satisfied with it. I mostly was. I mostly am. I just don't always know what to do with the hours between finishing work and falling asleep, which are the hours that living in a house alone is most noticeable. That is the life I was living on the Wednesday morning in April when all of this began. Wednesdays I allow myself the coffee shop. The rest of the week I make my own at home and drink it in the truck. But Wednesdays are my short haul days, jobs inside the city, no more than a few miles from the house, and I leave 15 minutes later than usual. And I use those 15 minutes to sit at the place on 6th Street called Birch and Common and drink something somebody else made. I've done this for 3 years. It is the closest thing to a weekly ritual that I have, and I am embarrassed by how much I look forward to it. I ordered my usual at the counter that Wednesday. Medium coffee, black. I was reaching for my wallet when I became aware of the woman behind me in line. I had noticed her before I got to the counter the way you notice, without meaning to. Someone who is working hard at something invisible. She was about 2 people back when I came in. Dark hair loose around her face, wearing a coat that was slightly too large for her in the way of something grabbed for warmth rather than fit. She was holding a travel mug she'd brought from home. She was looking at the menu board with the focused expression of someone who is not actually reading the menu board, who is somewhere far from the menu board and is using it as a surface to look at, while they are actually somewhere else. She looked like she was holding a lot of things steady, and had been for a while. I don't know exactly why I did what I did next. I'm not a man who performs generosity. I don't do things for effect. But when I got to the counter, I told the woman at the register that I'd cover whatever the woman behind me ordered as well, pointed briefly back over my shoulder, and asked her to keep it quiet about it. Then I paid, moved to the end of the counter to wait for my cup, and didn't look back. I took my coffee when it came and walked out the front door. I was about 2/3 of the way across the small parking lot when I heard the door open behind me. She said, "Wait." I turned around. She was on the sidewalk outside the door, coat pulled around her. The coffee I'd bought in one hand and her own travel mug still in the other because she hadn't thought to put it down. Her face had the particular expression of someone who has made a decision quickly and is not entirely sure it was the right one, but is committed to it now. She said, "Please don't go." There was something in the please that stopped me completely. Not the request, the weight underneath it. The please had months in it. I stopped. I said, "Okay." I almost didn't. I want to be clear about that. I had a site to get to. I had a retaining wall on the east side of town that needed 3 more courses and a cleanup before the homeowner came home at noon. I had mortar to mix, and level to check, and stones still on the trailer. The sensible thing was to say I was glad she'd gotten her coffee, and wish her a good morning, and get in my truck. But there was something in the way she was standing there that made the sensible thing feel like a door closing. She crossed the parking lot to where I was standing. Up close she looked younger than I'd thought, 27 or 28, and the coat, which was a man's coat, had a collar she'd turned up around her neck. Her eyes were dry, but had the look of eyes that had recently not been dry and had been made to stop. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't make a habit of running after strangers in parking lots. I said, "I figure it's the exception rather than the rule." She said, "It really was just the coffee." "I know that sounds." She paused. "I almost didn't come out today. I've been having a really bad few months, and this morning was one of the mornings where getting out the door was the whole effort. And I was standing in that line feeling like I was made of glass, and then you did that." She stopped. I just couldn't let you walk away without saying something. I know you don't know me. I said, "What's your name?" She said, "June." I said, "Dean." I looked at her. "What would you do if I didn't go? We'd have to stand here and talk about something." She looked at me for a second with an expression I couldn't entirely place. Then she laughed. Not a polished laugh, not a performance, just a sudden surprised sound that came out of her before she decided to let it. It changed her face. I noted the change. I said, "You want to sit back down for a few minutes?" She said she didn't want to make me late. I said a retaining wall on Maplewood had waited 6 weeks for someone to hire me. It could wait another 20 minutes. We went back inside. She sat across from me with her 2 cups of coffee, which she seemed to only then notice she was still holding, and she put them both on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then at me. She said her father had died in February, that she'd spent the year before that managing his care from 3 states away while he'd been sick, flying back every few weeks, handling the logistics that her brother hadn't stepped up to handle, that she'd done it competently and without visible collapse, which was the thing she always did, which was also why nobody thought to ask how she was doing afterward. She said she'd come back to Zanesville 2 months ago. She'd been living in Columbus because it was where her father was from, and she'd needed to be somewhere that felt like him, and she hadn't been able to explain that to anyone in a way that made complete sense. She said, "I got good at being the capable one a long time ago. The problem with being the capable one is that nobody gives you permission to not be okay." I said, "You don't need permission." She looked at me like I'd said something that required consideration. I said it wasn't a profound thought. It was just a fact. She didn't have to ask to not be okay. She was just not okay, and that was the state of things, and maybe the relevant question was what came after it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Most people say it gets better." Or that he'd want her to be strong, or something else that makes them feel better for having said something. I said, "I'm a mason. I don't build things that get better on their own. Things get better because somebody does the work." She looked at me again with that same expression, like she was assessing something she hadn't expected. She paid me back for the coffee via Venmo before she left, except that I didn't have Venmo, which she found remarkable, so she gave me her number to text her my account information. I texted her that evening. She wrote back. Then we kept writing back. Not a lot and not about anything large, but regularly and genuinely, the way you correspond with someone when you find out that the words go somewhere useful. 3 weeks after the coffee shop, she asked if she could come see me work. I was repairing a retaining wall on Brentwood, a long section of dry stacked limestone that had been shifting for years and had finally moved enough that the homeowner couldn't pretend anymore. It was the kind of repair I like best, mostly dismantling, careful evaluation of what's actually failing, then rebuilding with the respect of understanding the original intent. June arrived at around noon with food in a bag and the serious, interested eyes of someone who had decided to pay attention. She stood behind me while I worked and didn't talk, which I appreciated. After a while, she asked what I was looking for when I held a stone up before placing it. I said I was reading the face, looking for the side that had been exposed to weather, which would be the same face that had been exposed before, because the stone remembered what it was asked to do. She said that was interesting, and she said it in the way of someone who already had a question forming. She looked at the wall I'd partially dismantled, and then at the area behind it, the earth side, the side nobody sees. She said, "Is there drainage behind this?" I said, "There's supposed to be." She said, "My father was a civil engineer. He used to say retaining walls don't fail from the front." They fail from the back, from water pressure that builds up when there's nowhere to go. She paused. Is that drain tile I can see down there? Is it blocked? I looked where she was pointing. I went down and cleared the debris from around the drain tile at the base of the excavation. The pipe was packed tight with silt and root intrusion, completely blocked. The soil behind the wall had been holding water like a bowl for years. That was the whole failure. I'd been looking at the wall, and the problem was entirely behind it. I stood up and looked at her. She said, mildly, I might have learned some things on those job site visits. I said, you just saved this homeowner a wall that would have failed again in 14 months. She said she'd told me what she knew. I was the one who'd fixed it. She said it the same way she said most things, directly, without needing the credit, handing it back in a way that felt like honesty rather than modesty. Then she opened the bag she'd brought and asked if I wanted a sandwich. I ate a sandwich standing beside a half-demolished retaining wall in April sunshine, and she sat on the tailgate of my truck, and we talked about her father's work, the projects he'd done, the way he'd talked about engineering as being primarily about understanding failure rather than success. She said he used to tell her that every structure you build is a list of the failures it's been designed to survive, and the ones that fell down were the ones nobody imagined the right failure. She said she'd thought about that a lot since February. I said it was a good way to think about building. Probably a good way to think about other things, too. She looked at me with the same reading expression she'd had across the table at Birchen Common 3 weeks before. The expression of someone making a note. Somewhere between the job site on Brentwood and the evening in late May when she came for dinner the first time, a routine had established itself quietly and without announcement. She knew my schedule. I knew hers. She was working remotely for a legal services company out of Columbus. Administrative coordination, the kind of organizational precision she was clearly gifted at, and she could work from anywhere. Which at this point in her life meant from Zanesville, which had become both a practical choice and a necessary one. She came to the house on a Thursday evening, and I made chili, which is the dish I can make without thinking, and we ate at the kitchen table and then took our bowls out to the porch, because the evening was warm enough. The porch has 2 chairs I built from leftover lumber, plain and uneven and entirely functional, and we sat in them and watched the end of the light. After a while, she was quiet in a different way than the quiet of the conversation, the kind of quiet that is a person deciding whether to say something. She said, I don't know how to do this part. I said, what part? She said, being not okay when the emergency is over. She said, when there's a crisis, I know what to do. I make lists. I make calls. I manage the steps. I held it together for a whole year, and then I held it together at the funeral, and then I held it together through the estate paperwork, and then everyone went home. And the crisis was over, and there was nothing to manage. She paused. And I realized I didn't know how to just be sad. I'd been so busy being useful that I'd skipped it. I said, some things need to be said even when nobody's asking. She said, the problem is I surrounded myself with people who aren't asking. I said, you said that like it's a permanent condition. She looked at me. I said, I'm asking. She was quiet for a long moment. The porch was dim, and the street was quiet, and somewhere a block over someone was running a lawnmower late into the evening. Then she talked. Not a speech, not a release valve opening, just talking about her father. About the last visit before he got too sick to enjoy company. About a specific Saturday in October when he'd been good, and they'd sat outside in exactly the kind of evening we were sitting in now, And he'd told her he was proud of her in a way he hadn't said since she was young, and she'd almost said something back, and then she hadn't. And that was the last Saturday like that. And she thinks about it. I listened. I didn't offer anything for a while, because there was nothing to offer. After she finished, there was a quiet between us that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that settles after something has been said for the first time and doesn't need anything added to it. I reached over. She had a blister on her palm from a burn she'd gotten cooking. I'd watched her be careful of it all evening, the small adjustments a person makes around a hurt they've decided to work around rather than mention. I turned her hand over gently in mine and looked at it in the low light. I didn't say anything about it. I just held her hand for a moment, carefully, the way you hold something that has been through something hard. And then I put it back down. She looked at me afterward. I didn't try to name what was in that look. I just held it, the same way I'd held her hand, carefully, without gripping too hard. Her brother Nathan arrived in early June. He drove up from Columbus with the specific energy of someone who has allowed a convenient amount of time to pass before getting involved. He was 35, and he wore it well, and he had the polished, reasonable manner of someone who has navigated most rooms by being the person others feel obligated to defer to. He'd come ostensibly to go through some final items at the storage unit that still held their father's belongings, equipment, tools, the civil engineering manuals and site binders their father had kept for decades, things that needed deciding on. June asked me to drive her. I said yes without asking why she needed me to come, because the way she asked told me why. The storage facility was on the edge of town, a plain cinder block building with a rolling metal door. Nathan was already there when we arrived. He shook my hand with the grip of a man who was making an assessment, said it was good to meet me in a tone that meant neither thing, and turned his attention to the boxes. For the first hour it was fine. They went through items methodically, Nathan directing, June agreeing or redirecting, the kind of practical sorting that is its own small grief. I carried boxes and held things when asked, and stayed in the useful part of the room. Then Nathan found the toolbox. It was their father's, a large chest of drafting and field tools, compasses, levels, marking gauges, the organized instruments of a working engineer who had kept things precisely. Nathan picked it up, set it aside, said he'd take it back to Columbus. June said she'd already taken it into consideration. He said that what she'd taken into consideration and what was equitable weren't the same thing, and he said it mildly, and he said it with a smile. Then, he said she should think about whether the choices she'd been making lately, moving here, the distance from her actual life, this, and he didn't specify what this meant, but he looked at me briefly when he said it, were really about what she needed, or about filling a space that her father had left. He said he wasn't criticizing, he just thought she should be honest with herself. He said he was worried about her. He said it in the specific tone of someone using concern as a weight. I set down the box I was holding. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move toward him. I said, "She packed up your father's house alone. She handled the hospice calls and the paperwork and the arrangements. She did that for a year while you were in Columbus, deciding not to come home." I said it flat, like something from a work log. "I'm not sure what part of where she is now is your concern." Nathan looked at me. He did the recalibration of a man who hadn't expected a plain sentence and didn't have a smooth response ready for one. June stepped forward. She didn't look at me when she did it. She said, "You have never once asked how I was." "In a year, Nathan, not once." She said it without anger, which was what made it land the way it did. "I'm not doing this with you. If you want to be involved in the estate, you can call the attorney. If you want to have a relationship with me, you're going to have to actually try. Those are the options." She said, The toolbox was Dad's. I'll decide what happens to it. Nathan stood in the storage unit with the particular look of a man who has been handed a mirror. He didn't take the toolbox. He left shortly after, smooth and appropriate in his exit, the way people are when they've lost the room and know it. June stood for a moment in the quiet of the storage unit, surrounded by the remains of her father's working life, the levels and compasses and binders full of sight drawings in his careful hand. She didn't cry. She just stood there for a moment, and then she said she thought she was ready to go. We drove back through Zanesville in the early evening, the city going amber around us, the Y Bridge visible for a moment as we crossed near the river. She was looking out the passenger window. I let the silence be what it was for a while. About 20 minutes from the house, she said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "There's something I want to say." She turned from the window and looked at me. I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "I almost didn't stop when you called after me in that parking lot. I want you to know that. I had a wall to get to and I was already half in my truck in my head, and when you came out the door I almost just waved and kept going." I paused. I'm not someone who does the big gesture. I bought you a coffee because it was Tuesday, and you looked like no one had done a single thing for you in a long time, and it was a small thing I could do without making a production of it. That's all it was. She was quiet. I said, but I stopped. And I went back inside. And I've been stopped ever since. I said it the way I say things about the work, not embellished, just precise. I lay things one course at a time. That's all I know how to do. But I want you to know that there's something built now, on my end. Something that didn't exist in April. And it was built out of nothing more extraordinary than two people who kept showing up in the same direction. She said, "I ran after you because I was afraid you were going to be the last decent person who walked past me and I was going to let you go." I said, "I'm not walking past you." She said, "I know that now." I said, "Do you?" "Because I want you to actually know it, not just believe it when things are easy." She reached over and took my hand from the wheel and held it in hers on the center console. She held it the same way I'd held hers on the porch, carefully, certain. She said, "I ran after you once. I'll do it again if I have to. I drove." I said, "You won't have to." She said, "I know." We drove the rest of the way home with her hand in mine. The city went past. The evening came down. There is a retaining wall on the east side of Zanesville that I built from scratch that fall. June picked every stone. I am not being romantic about it. She came to the quarry with me on a Saturday and spent 2 hours going through the limestone and selecting pieces, and her choices were good ones. And when the wall was finished, the homeowner said it was the best-looking job she'd ever seen. I told her the stones were well chosen. She looked at me and said she'd had help. June went back to Columbus in October, not to leave, but because the legal services company offered her a position she'd been quietly working toward for 2 years. A real one, with a title and a team, and the kind of work that uses what she actually is, rather than what she can manage. She took the apartment she'd been subletting, signed a full lease. The drive between Columbus and Zanesville is 1 hour and 20 minutes on the 70. Neither of us has done the math on what comes next, but we've both stopped pretending the math doesn't exist. I drive it on Friday evenings. She drives it back on Sunday afternoons. In between, she sends me photographs of things she sees: old stone walls in Columbus neighborhoods, brick facades on the short streets near her building, a chimney on a row house on High Street that is doing something structurally interesting she can't entirely explain, but wants me to look at. I look at every photograph. I give my opinion on every chimney. Her father's toolbox is on the shelf in her apartment. I built the shelf. Walt 2 doors down, asked me last month if I was seeing someone. I told him yes. He looked satisfied in the specific way of a man who has been waiting to ask that question for a while. He said he figured, because I'd stopped sitting on the porch looking at nothing in particular. He said that was a good development, in his opinion. I thought about that for a while, about what it means to sit on a porch and look at nothing in particular, and what it means to stop. I've spent 8 years understanding that the mortar is the work, that the thing between things is what holds the whole structure, that a wall is not made of stones, it's made of the decision, repeated endlessly and without glory, to put one stone beside another and pack the joint properly and wait for it to cure. No stone is load-bearing on its own. Every stone needs the ones around it, and the mortar that fills what's between them. And it needs someone patient enough to do that part, without rushing. A woman ran after me in a parking lot in April and said, "Wait, please don't go," and I stopped. And I have been stopped in the best possible sense since that morning. Stopped from the life I was building one quiet day at a time, in which I was useful and capable and completely alone. The small thing was a coffee. The small thing was always the whole of it. That's what holds.